Thank you very much. Thank you to the Mayor's Institute on City Design for this opportunity to present the second phase to this Safe Places, Active Spaces presentation. I will share my screen. So can you guys see my screen? Awesome. So again, my name is Ifeoma Ebo, founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy. I'm a trained architect, planner, and urban designer. I'm also an educator. I teach at Syracuse University and Columbia Graduate School for Architecture, Planning, Preservation. I spent 3 years working for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City as their first in-house design advisor addressing social justice and public safety in and around public housing across New York City. And really the approach that you're seeing here is born out of that experience and that work and that collaborative work, ideating with communities, with nonprofit organizations, and other government agencies and partners. So I just want to just frame what you're going to see moving forward, but from myself and Mariela. I will be talking about the Safe Places, Active Spaces capacity building program, really as a step 2 to the presentation that I shared before, which I hope you do, go back and take a look at. This is really digging deeper into what is that framework that really allows those placemaking projects to happen, that really builds the leadership in communities. And then I'm really excited to be accompanied by Mariela, who's going to share a lot of her work around data-driven technology that really strives to maximize impact through community participation in research. So just a little bit about Creative Urban Alchemy, which is my consultancy. My process is really about co-creation. It's about co-partnership with community, defining the problem together, because oftentimes as government representatives or as private sector, we can think we know what the actual problem is, but we really need to center the lived experience of community in defining problems, even in ideating and brainstorming and designing solutions, and even in the implementation and stewardship of public space. And this is thinking through public space or any type of city design, urban design, built environment solution. And also just that what that equates to is really building trust and the co-ownership of places and spaces in the community. And I think all of the entire process is a way of integrating many facets, the intersectionality of justice, whether it's restorative, political, health, economic, all the different facets of justice can be addressed through this type of co-creation and equity-centered, really, process. And they all really feed into an approach that centers spatial justice. And this is really what Creative Urban Alchemy is all about. And so I want to do a bit of a reprisal of just to return to some of the key aspects of the first presentation, just to jog your memory on what I presented before. And so on the slides that you see, you'll see a few data points around the importance of public space and why public space matters for crime and public safety. So a main goal of Safe Places, Active Spaces program is to encourage partnerships between residents, community organizations, local businesses, industry, and government stakeholders in addressing neighborhood safety through the activation of public space. Evidence-based research shows that there's a strong correlation between the improvement and activation of public space and positive change in the family of related challenges that impact neighborhood safety, namely youth engagement, violence prevention, culture and community, built environment, jobs and small businesses, and health and wellness. These challenges connect with public space and public safety in 3 primary ways. The first is civic trust and appreciation. Studies show that people who live in a community they think is beautiful or report high availability of community events or report an abundance of outdoor recreation spaces are more likely to trust government and view local police positively. When individuals feel that they are a part of a collective civic identity, they appreciate the value of public spaces and feel invited to participate. Individuals also recognize local government and other responsible parties that provide and maintain collective civic assets. Now, all of this is important when you're thinking about how do you build trust? How do you work with communities that have been systematically marginalized, perhaps don't even believe that government is doing work for them or in their best interests? You really have to think about civic trust and appreciation, and what are ways to leverage the built environment, the transformation of the built environment in order to build that trust. The next aspect is participation in public life. Studies show that rates of violence are lower in urban neighborhoods characterized by collective efficacy, that is, mutual trust among neighbors, combined with a willingness to intervene on behalf of the common good, specifically to maintain order. Public spaces entice and provide the opportunity for contact and socialization with neighbors and strangers, facilitating equitable access and positive interactions among diverse groups. Now, really, this is critical, especially when we're talking about like a lot of the impetus behind the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of the relationship that community have with their local law enforcement. How can you foster and build that trust and positive relationships and interactions between the two? And the third point is stewardship of the public realm. People who live in a community with high levels of community events are more likely to think they have an impact on their community and more likely to work with others in doing so, relative to people in places with few community events. Now, this involvement, this stewardship, participation, civic engagement, these are all indicators of trust being built, but they can only be done over time. It's not something that is instant, but you can leverage public spaces and transformation of the built environment as a tool, an avenue to achieve that. Now, all of this placemaking, it looks really beautiful and it looks wonderful when it's complete, but how do you actually accomplish placemaking? How do you accomplish co-creation, co-defining, co-designing, and co-implementing? There's a whole framework behind it. And in the work that I did in New York City, you can see this framework here that's really quite complex. It involves training, it involves collective ideating and vision building, action planning, it involves participatory budgeting, it involves resource provision, advisory groups, guidance, activation, placemaking, evaluation. There are so many components of it, and I'll go into more detail. But the point I'm trying to make is really that the program needs to be robust and it needs to be centered on capacity building, building of leaders in the community. Because if you do it right the first time, this is a program that can sustain itself. It's an initiative that can sustain itself through community-driven action. So the first part of it is training. And these are 4 principles that I like to center the training on. And it really is about building capacity of residents, but actually it's also about building capacity of your local law enforcement to partner with community in co-creating and problem solving together. The first aspect of it is cultivation of wealth. Cultivating wealth is the idea that places have potential to cultivate and strengthen a wealth of assets and resources to maintain social, physical, or economic balance. Supporting the cultivation of these assets and resources, such as time, talent, and community treasures, provides the freedom to risk, learn, to grow. This first part of the training is supporting communities in identifying that potential, those places and spaces where things work and where things do not work, and brainstorming what nurturing needs to happen to transform the difference. The second part of the training is centering the lived experience. Lived experience of communities is an important expertise. Center it so that it can be a guide and touchstone of all work. Lived experience is also about the supportive relationships and interactions in a community and between community members to identify spaces that are not safe and to maintain a sense of safety. A strong understanding of the collective lived experience will increase the ability for residents to address issues in an effective manner as they arise. It builds the glue or cohesion between residents. Cohesion through a shared understanding of the collective lived experience is also the social awareness to appreciate how positive relationships create and strengthen a sense of unity and security through participation. This can be facilitated through community programs, festivals, collective agreements, leadership groups, and restorative justice programs. The third principle in training is about choosing critical connections over critical mass. This training principle focuses on the interactions and relationships external to the neighborhood or place. It is important to establish for residents to establish positive communication and external communities with external communities and stakeholders towards a collective approach to community safety. Safety is not just, it doesn't just sit in one place and when you eradicate it, it goes away. It can shift and also return, hence the importance to partner with external neighborhood entities. It refers to strategic external social and political relationships, such as partnerships with other neighborhoods, communicating in a manner that fosters acceptance and inclusion. This takes the place in the form of partnerships with government, nonprofits, and local banks. And then the final principle for training is protect and strengthen culture. Make visible this and strengthen the pro-social culture in the community and honor their sacredness and prevent their erasure. The producers of that culture, such as the local assets, leaders, institutions, and businesses, must be amplified, resourced, and supported. Local culture is about neighborhoods creating a unique context or place of their own environment. Ultimately, shared culture brings people together to support the well-being and safety of all users. It reinforces a sense of belonging, which is important to the stewardship and collective protection of places and spaces. The next aspect is data collection, taking residents through site audits where they walk around their community to really identify what are those aspects of their community that are dysfunctional, that actually create opportunities for crime to happen. And that can happen through mapping. As you see in the map there of Stapleton houses, you see the different colors. The different colors signify different kinds of crime, different levels of crime in a community. And the mapping exercise can really be helpful for communities to really understand the relationship between their lived experience and this geolocation, the spatial location of those places and spaces and those encounters that make them feel unsafe. So they create those connections. And this is all a part of the training. And then the next part is about vision building and action planning. And you can also use mapping as a way, as a tool for vision building. And this is where you bring in architects and designers to support communities in creating the visualizations that they have in their mind. This is about collective ideation, collective brainstorming, imagining together. And then with architects and designers, they can actually provide the tools for residents to be able to realize the ideas that they have. And then creating an action plan is important. And this is a document that collects both the definition of the problem, the visions, and the action planning that residents put together. But then also it needs to be resourced and supported through guidance. And this is where partnership with government can happen, where you bring in different government agencies such as the Parks Department or the Department of Transportation to really provide guidance to residents on how they can implement their projects, what type of permitting they may need. Also to provide the financial resources to implement their projects in partnership. So they can both identify in what ways will residents steward these spaces and in what ways will government also support the maintenance of these spaces. There's a link when they share this presentation afterwards, there's a link here to a document that was produced as a culmination of the work that I did at the mayor's office in New York City, a community playbook for transforming public spaces, where we actually provided a wealth of resources to residents in partnership with the Parks Department and the Department of Transportation, as well as the New York City Housing Authority, on how residents can actually transform places and spaces in their community. And so these transformation projects, these placemaking projects need to happen in sequence. And the first aspect of that sequence is programming or space activation, and really thinking through how can you generate activity and excitement around a space. And that needs to happen through programming. And this can happen through festivals, programs in public space. You don't need to transform a space yet, but you do need to generate the excitement around that space through a series of programming. And that program also can build that self-awareness, create spaces where people can share their lived experience and also talk about the social awareness, who belongs, who doesn't belong on their terms. And then the next aspect of the program is the actual placemaking, the actual creating of physical, tangible artifacts that can be placed in a space or actually physically transforming the space so that that programming, that activation, that energy that you've generated around a space that perhaps was a hot spot or a place that people felt unsafe, that energy gets translated and becomes more sustainable through the physical transformation of that place and space. And then finally, you have to think about while you're activating the spaces, when you transform the spaces, how are you evaluating? How do you know you're achieving success? What are you measuring? What are those indicators? And the first is participation. As I mentioned before, civic engagement, civic participation is an indicator of trust being built. The more people participate, the more they know that they're going to see an outcome that's to their benefit. Also, the use of that space. Is the use of the space changing as people feel more safe in a space? Are they feeling more comfortable using that space and coming out? Are there perceptions of safety and belonging? Is that changing and transforming? Because that's also important. The more people feel like they belong, the more they participate in activities and more they use the space. And then social cohesion, which is that trust between residents, but then also trust between community and government and community and their local law enforcement. And all of these aspects really come together to really define whether your Safe Places Active Spaces initiative is successful. And so I'm going to pass it over to Mariela, who's going to dig deeper into that data-driven technology-based approach and how to maximize impact through participatory research. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Ifeoma. That's so wonderful. And you guys will hopefully see the complementary whole is bigger than its sum nature of the work that Ifeoma does and what I've been working on. But it's an honor to be here with you all today. I think Trinity gave an excellent introduction of myself. The only thing I'll add is that I'm also a research professor at NYU, so kind of constantly bridging the worlds of academia and practice and now entrepreneurship. But in any case, so one of the most vivid memories that I have as a kid growing up in Miami, and I don't mean this Miami, I mean this Miami, is scrounging through my mom's beat up Pontiac for enough change to buy soup at Dunkin' Donuts. It was the end of the month and things were tight till next payday. As a first generation Latina and the daughter of a single mom struggling to buy on a secretary's salary, raising me and my brother with special needs, I have a lot of stories like this. Indeed, many of my most painful childhood memories are tied to cars. From the cry-inducing calls I used to get from my mechanic when I was at my work-study job, to the very long commutes that I used to take cross town to the private school that my mom had to sacrifice to send me to because we lived in a severely underfunded school district because of our low property values. And then ultimately to the death of my 15-year-old friend who was killed by a driver while crossing a street very similar to the one that I crossed on a near daily basis. But the thing is that my story is not unique. It's really emblematic of the inequitable ties between land use planning, transportation, and the built environment, and how it impacts all aspects of people's lives. So poorer neighborhoods mean poorer schools, poorer infrastructure, poorer mobility, and poorer quality of life. And never has this been more glaringly clear, at least to those not victim to these inequities, than in the post-2020 world. COVID magnified centuries-long spatial inequities within marginalized communities tied to structurally racist disinvestment in the built environment. And BLM, especially in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, amplified these pre-existing spatial injustices. Now, as someone whose lived experiences were shaped by many of these spatial inequities, I spent the last 20 years advocating for equitable access to livable, sustainable, and thriving places and promoting spatial justice by quantifying how design shapes us and how, in turn, those behaviors, choices, perceptions translate into economic, health, environmental, and social value or quality of life. Now, to kind of help you understand what I mean, let's take a look at these two streets. How does each make you feel? Which do you prefer? Which would you avoid? Well, their design influences more than just how we feel when we're walking down different types of streets, but the places we go, how we get there, what we do in each street, how safe we are, which then translates to the tangible stats and metrics that matter to mayors, their staff, and most importantly, to the people they represent. So things like reducing collisions or getting more children to safely walk to school, or improving health outcomes and mitigating GHGs, or reducing gun violence and improving community well-being. It's all interconnected, this relationship between place and people and quality of life. You can't really look at one without understanding the other. And so the fact that not everyone has equitable access to places that look like the street on the left means that their quality of life suffers disproportionately more than those that do, which accounts for disparities like the fact that Black pedestrians are 1.5 times more likely to be killed by a driver than are white pedestrians, or white people of color are half as likely to have a chain supermarket within a mile of where they live, which is then tied to why they're also 1.5 to 2 times more likely to have a chronic disease. And this list goes on and on. It's painfully clear that how design impacts us for better or worse hasn't been equitable and for centuries. So the question is, how might data and evidence not only help tell this story, but also co-create a different ending? How might the power of place be harnessed to heal and repair communities? And this is exactly what State of Place, the urban design data and predictive analytics software company that grew out of my life's work, helps cities accomplish. So specifically, we help city makers co-create more spatially just, livable, and sustainable communities by using data and evidence to quantify not only how design impacts social, environmental, health, and economic value, but also identifying patterns of divestment that translate into disparate community outcomes. Our software then translates this into evidence-based urban design priorities and recommendations, most likely to equitably foster desired quality of life outcomes and quantify the benefits and return on investment of making those changes. And this helps overcome two key challenges: how to make the most effective and cost-efficient decisions and establish priorities given limited budgets and seemingly competing interests, and how to engage communities more effectively by using data-driven processes that increase transparency and accountability, build trust, and drive the consensus that we need to get plans and projects approved and funded. So to better explain the why, how, and what of what we do and how this might help you, I'd like to tell the story of the city of Philadelphia, with whom we began working with last summer, as their struggles, especially in the aftermath of COVID and the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, are emblematic of the city making challenges we've helped many different cities address. So first, in Philly, it was clear that the same vulnerable communities typically most harmed by other crises, higher rates of chronic disease, higher exposure to environmental hazards, higher poverty, higher crime rates, were those that were the hardest hit by COVID, and that there was a common thread: urban design. The same built environment divestments tied to these poor quality of life outcomes made already vulnerable populations that much more susceptible to COVID and, frankly, other natural and man-made disasters. So we began with looking at 17 different zip codes throughout the city to quantify how inequitable and racist divestment patterns translate to multiple disparities across various aspects of quality of life using our 5-step process. So first, we automatically extract data on over 150 microscale urban design features like street trees, benches, sidewalks, bike lanes, curb cuts, you name it. And we do this from extracting it from digital street level images using visual machine learning. We then aggregate that into a score that we call the State of Place Index, which measures walkability, bikeability, overall quality of place. And that's broken down into 10 aspects of urban design that we know from an evidence perspective actually impacts various aspects of quality of life. And then this establishes a baseline of community assets and needs that the software provides and shows graphically, and also identifies patterns of spatial injustices throughout the city that you can look at geospatially. Now, in the case of Philadelphia, we also pulled and mapped data on social, health, and environmental outcomes to understand, again, the inequitable impact of centuries-long structurally racist disinvestment patterns across different sort of city goals. But mapping the tragically obvious that place impacts people's lives inequitably only helps so much. The goal is action and equitable change. So to do that, we create forecasting models that help us quantify which urban design changes are actually most likely to lead to improved quality of life and spur spatial equity. So in Philly, we created forecasting models that showed that places with a lower state of place index had disproportionately higher rates of COVID in transmissions, hospitalizations, and deaths. They had higher rates of chronic disease like asthma, higher average temperatures, were more likely to be in the floodplain, and had more crime. And they were also the most vulnerable, with higher concentrations of Black residents, lower income households, lower education levels, higher household sizes, less access to vehicles, and less likely to work from home. Now, the bad news is that poor quality places translates to higher vulnerability across the board. The good news is that even small improvements to urban design can lead to measurable change. So to help you really kind of understand what this means, for example, for COVID, urban design improvements that would increase the state of place index as little as 5 points could have meant 1 less COVID death. Increasing it by 10 points, 5 fewer folks in the hospital. 20 points, a reduced transmission rate by about 0.5%. Or comparing places with a below versus above average state of place index, the differences in COVID outcomes were staggering, as you can see. Now, similarly, places in the floodplain score 17% less on the state of place index on average than those that aren't. And it's the same story with heat, an increase in this case in the 10 points in the parks and public spaces sub-index reduces temperature by 0.5 degree. And then with crime, when comparing places with a below average state of place index, who also had a higher percentage of Black residents, lower incomes, and lower rates of education, compared to places that had an above average state of place index, places with better urban design had 8.7 times fewer homicides. Now, we found the same patterns of diabetes, asthma, assaults, and more. And with those most vulnerable more likely to live in places with lower state of place indices, you can quantify what spatial inequity means in people's everyday lives and prioritize environment investments that will make them better. So while these findings kind of on their face may seem academic, our software translates all of this into actionable recommendations and priorities for urban design improvements that'll most effectively and also cost efficiently lead to desired outcomes. In other words, some urban design changes matter more for reducing diabetes, and others are, more important for reducing driving rates. And so which urban design changes should be prioritized depends on which set of goals are most important for communities. For Philadelphia, this could mean adding trees, parks, lighting, or bike lanes, but ultimately the key is to co-create the mix of changes with communities. It's up to them to imagine the possibilities and test, iterate, and prioritize changes, and test before-after concepts in real time to see how desired changes improve the state of place index. And this is where community-led approaches like those Ifeoma nurtures are so critical. Our goal with Philly is to have them use the state of place scenario tool alongside the community, but then also use our forecasting tools to quantify how those small changes can improve lives. So for example, in this scenario, this nearly 70-point increase in the state of place index could mean drops in vehicle collisions, chronic disease, crime, and vehicle miles traveled. And as you can see, and you can kind of dig into this when you get the PowerPoint, these are pretty staggering differences. And so state of place quantifies these benefits to help communities more effectively vie for funding and approvals and make equitable change a reality. Ultimately, this is a story around how microscale data and predictive forecasting helps efficiently prioritize funds to ensure you as the city and the community achieve desired outcomes while also building the engagement and trust and increasing transparency around the rationale for your decisions, all with the goal of creating more equitable built environments that lead to happier, healthier, safer communities. Now, COVID has laid bare what many of us already knew, that marginalized communities have been disproportionately suffering, and that suffering is largely due to structurally racist policies that manifested in spatially inequitable places, which depress the prosperity, health, social, and environmental value of vulnerable communities. Now, you can't unsee that, and we must not unsee that. We cannot continue to ignore the critical need to invest in better urban design within historically marginalized communities. It literally impacts every aspect of people's lives. So place can never again be weaponized. It must be harnessed as a tool to restore, repair, and heal. And State of Place's data-driven city-making platform can help you ensure that this happens effectively, cost efficiently, and inclusively, and help us collectively write a much happier ending for countless communities whom we've harmed for centuries. But in the end, we're a software company. So the most we can do is to design a super fun, SimCity-like experience that facilitates the kinds of co-creation processes which Ifeoma fosters that are needed to truly see the exponential benefits of data-driven, place-led approaches. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ifeoma, who will discuss kind of how these two complementary approaches, when combined, can have exponential benefits, both for the community and for quality of life.
Thanks so much, Mariela. And just in conclusion, there's this combination that we're trying to emphasize here of, everything is community-led, everything is participatory, whether it's the actual defining, co-creating stewardship of spaces, but then also the data-driven research that the two together, when you actually center the lived experience and center residents in that process and build their capacity to be able to participate in both processes, that is trust building. That is moving at the speed of trust. And you do get a project that is a lot more sustainable. It's a lot more supportive of building community leaders, and it can be sustained by the community itself. And they can actually determine how problems are solved on their own, but with the guidance and support of government. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share our work. And we're really quite excited about the discussion and questions.